So good afternoon, everybody, to everybody down in the Pollock, and thanks so much for joining us for the sort of final event in our 2023 feature series Big Screen and the final event of the academic year. My name is Tyler Morgenstern. I am the Assistant Director of the Carsey-Wolf Center, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this afternoon's discussion with our extremely special guest who's on screen with me here, celebrated director and screenwriter Todd Field. Todd, welcome.
Thank you. Good
How you
to
doing
be here. Hello, everyone.
You'll have to just sort of imagine a theater full of people downstairs, but so we've just been able to get through Tar, and I really just have to say we're so delighted to have you with us this afternoon to talk about this remarkable film. It's truly one of my favorite films of the last several years, maybe one of my favorite films, period. And it's such a delight and such a thrill to be able to see it again on a big screen with proper sound down in the Pollock. It's such a thrill to see this film that's so fully realized, sort of the way that it really should be seen. Every time I've seen it, I've been so struck by what you've been able to achieve aesthetically and technically. The film feels both sort of sweeping and ambitious and almost kind of wild in its scope, and maybe we'll talk about that in a bit, but it's very sort of sleek and elegant and restrained in its execution in a lot of ways. So there's obviously lots to talk about with this film thematically and the ideas that you contend with and the themes. But before we get to that, I wonder if I could just ask a really broad question, which is if you can speak about the sort of vision for the film. How was it that you imagined this world of Lydia Tár's? Because it really is a world. She's nothing else if not a kind of orchestrator and a manager of a very particular kind of world. So how did you think about creating that space, creating that whole universe around her, particularly since it's so different from the kind of scenarios and the landscape of your prior two films, which are both take place in these small, bucolic New England towns and play out more as chamber dramas, and so take place on a somewhat smaller scale. So I wonder if you can just talk us through about the making of the world of Tar.
Right. Well, I mean, yes, there's a contrast between this setting and, say, some fairy tale leafy Massachusetts suburbia, and then a small coastal town in Maine. But those are just backdrops. I think that I'm interested in human beings, and this was a character who. And also, I think it's probably worth pointing out that one stark difference is that those were both adaptations, and so the characters that were in those other two films, I was blessed because I was in dialogue with the creators and the authors of that underlying material, and those people were wonderful to collaborate with. Andre Dubus and Tom Perrotta. But no matter where we push those characters, no matter how much they changed in terms of transposing that literature to screen, ultimately the genesis for those characters came from these two artists. The difference here was I had been filling up a lot of notebooks over the years, and this was one character that I simply could not get to shut up, and I didn't know what I would do with her. I knew I knew she was in a hermetic system, some kind of power structure, and it had nothing to do with classical music. I didn't know what it had to do with. I knew that she was atop an organization. And right at the beginning of the first lockdown in March 2020, the studio had come to me and said, would you ever write a film about a conductor? And I was like, a conductor? That seems really boring, I don't think I would want to do that, and I had a writing assignment maybe 15 years before that, just a piece of writing that was about a young conductor. So I tiptoed into that world, but I didn't know a great deal about it. But then the world shut down, and I thought, wow, well, I don't have anything else to do. And then I remembered wait a minute, I've got this character. That's what she'll do. And, you know, I was stuck here in this chair, and so was everybody else in their chair. And I was very, very lucky because John Mauceri, who had been Leonard Bernstein's assistant for, you know, 18 years and had conducted, you know, movie nights for the Hollywood Bowl and taught at Yale, et cetera, was also stuck in his chair. And he agreed basically to give me a few weeks of his time on the telephone. And so that's really sort of how it started, you know. And once you go into the world of concert music or classical music, there's a lot to get excited about, you know. And to have the enthusiasm of an amateur walking into that world, it's so rich, you know. The history of it is so incredible, and I had to kind of come in there with like and try to fall in love really fast, because I had to figure out, what did she fall in love with, you know. What turned her on? What were her ultimate goals? What were the benchmarks of success for her? And so that was that was a stark difference between, say, In the Bedroom and Little Children and Tar.
Mm-hmm. I want to sort of dig into that a little bit further, but think about it a little bit in terms of the sort of visual style of the film, because it does have this very distinctive and, again, like quite restrained, but still really ambitious visual style. Thinking about it in relationship to In the Bedroom from 2001 and Little Children in 2006, it feels of a piece with those films in the sense that you seem to have a habit of pairing really explosive or potentially explosive subject matter with a kind of stylistic restraint or austerity that often gets compared by critics to people like Michael Haneke or Stanley Kubrick, although whether those are austere filmmakers is a question for another time. I'm not convinced by that, but these comparisons do come up. Reviews of Tar, for instance, describe it as controlled, as chilly, demonstrating a, quote, refrigerated sleekness, as one interview in The Guardian put it. And I just wonder if you can think aloud about that for a little bit. The way that you employ restraint and subtraction as a way of building stories and telling stories that contend with really explosive and difficult subject matter. I'm just thinking, as I was watching the film again and thinking about it in the context of your work, I thought about Sissy Spacek's line from In the Bedroom, where she's describing the grief of losing her son. Sorry, spoiler alert to everybody in the theater. Sorry. She says at one point, it comes in waves, then nothing, like a rest in music, silent but so loud. And it felt to me as almost sort of like a statement about your style as a filmmaker. So I wonder if you can just think about that a little bit for us.
Bless you, Tyler. You're the first person to ever say that. You just found the sort of Rosetta Stone for me, that line. Yeah, that's kind of it. I think you put your finger right on it. You know, I started out as a musician and sort of wandered into the theatrical arts, you know, by happenstance. And so music was really important to me. You know, sound is really important to me. Rhythm is really important to me. And always has been, you know, since I was a child. I worked as a young actor for several years with all kinds of artists. And the people that I enjoy working with the most had the most intent behind their work. And we weren't doing 6 setups. I hated acting like that. I didn't like it. You know, actors often get a real bum deal in movies. It's not, you know, any actor will tell you with a straight face, it's not an actor's medium. They're at total mercy of the filmmaker. And you can make a great actor look terrible, and you can make a second-rate actor look passable in film. It's very plastic, you know. So you know, since I was a fellow at the American Film Institute, so through this film, I think if you don't think my approach hasn't really changed a great deal. You know, I try to find where to put the camera. You know, and the camera, if the camera is going to move, I want the camera to move with intent. It's really that simple. And I've been really very lucky to work with the performers that I've worked with and collaborate with incredible actors over the years. And it's thrilling for me in that collaboration to see what they can do, you know, with no strings and no nets, no safety nets. And you know, every time you cut, the audience is aware of it, or they're expecting, when are they going to cut, or when's this going to happen, and to try to erase that as much as possible, so that they have the ability to get involved in a film, and hopefully be able to own the film as much as possible, because they have a more direct relationship with the performer. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up performance in the context of this question of style, simply because this film obviously turns in this remarkable set of performances from Cate Blanchett, obviously, but also the wider cast, Noémie Merlan and Nina Haas, just such an incredible cast and such a wonderful and nuanced set of performances. And as I was preparing for this event, I read an interview with your wonderful DP, Florian Hofmeister, in Filmmaker magazine, where he used a phrase, I can't remember it exactly, but he expressed it. He said that what we wanted to do, Todd and I, was to sort of try and turn editorial control of the film, or the editorial work of the film, over to the performances. So rather than the editing living just in the edit room in post, that the editing was really the engine behind it, was these performances. And there's these moments in the film where that is so clear, and it feels almost so daring. I mean, there's obviously the really striking long take when Tár is leading the master class at Juilliard, which is an incredible achievement, and it's really exhilarating to watch. But the one that struck me this watch was in the interview with Adam Gopnik that sort of opens the film. There's a shot that you hold of Cate Blanchett that's 2-3 minutes long when she's discussing Gustav Mahler. The camera doesn't move. It doesn't cut back a reverse shot to Gopnik. It's not cut as an interview. You just let Cate act. And you allow that performance to play out as a performance. And it's such a kind of, for what seems like a very sort of like static shot, it comes off, it feels very exhilarating, and quite bold and daring to just let an actor act.
Well, that's it. Those two scenes specifically, and I think that's, I didn't read the filmmaker interview, but probably I'm assuming that that's what Florian was referencing, were these two scenes. And those two scenes, the contrast between those two scenes, and then I would argue the very last scene of the film, is really about, so the setup is, you know, she's being interviewed, and that interview is really the most important performance for the character of the film. She's the most nervous about that performance. That she's rehearsed it. She's rehearsed every line. She's, as we could see with her assistant, who's mouthing her biography that Adam is dutifully reading verbatim. She's left nothing to chance. No joke, no quip, nothing. So that's really kind of the most, even though we've met her in a very agitated state, that's the most in control we're going to see her in the entire story. So it's important that she has control. In the scene at Juilliard, we've gone through this one sort of prologue scene, but then we've had two very long scenes. The scene with Adam at Lincoln Center, and then the scene at La Bernardin with Mark Strong, who plays her benefactor, Kaplan. But what we haven't seen her move yet. And she spends a great deal of time talking about time, you know, talking about having, I start the clock, I have control of time. And so in the Juilliard scene, you know, we had talked about that scene a lot, and I kept saying to Florian, you know, it's going to be a really tough scene, because if we shoot it, it's going to be like 36 to 100 setups, and it's going to be really boring. She has to have control of it. She has to have control of the tempo of the scene, because it's the first time we've seen her move. So we can't cut, you know, and that was a really important decision. And but making that decision was very simple, and executing that decision was something else altogether. You know, that was really sort of like months of R&D. We had to invent equipment to do that shot. You know, you can't do it with any existing equipment. And of course, you know, that's very technical stuff. The actual blocking of that scene and the driving of that scene is done strictly by Kate Blanchett, you know. And that's really the sort of, again, the second time when you see this character who has total control, has total dominance, and is exploiting that dominance in a way that maybe is rigged and not very fair, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I just anecdotally, when I was down in the theater watching the film earlier, when this sequence started, I did hear somebody sitting in the row behind me whisper, "This is the shot." So, so it landed. You did great. You and Florian did great. You and
well, we were hoping that no one would notice it. You know, I mean, when we first screened the film in Venice, and Telluride, you'd see people about 9 minutes in would say, "Wait, have they cut yet?" You know, it wasn't meant to be a bravado, you know, oneer. It was meant, you know, as Florian said in the interview, strictly to have her be in control of the editorial, for her to be in control of the tempo. That was it.
Well, speaking of that control of the tempo and of Tar as the timekeeper, I did sort of want to return to this question of music, music thematically, music structurally, obviously at the very center of this film, but it's also something that returns in your filmmaking a lot, as a way of opening out the broader themes of whatever story you happen to be telling. And it seems to be a way in your filmmaking where you try and contend with this friction between a desire for control and the volatility of things like desire and feeling and all of these human messy things that get in the way of our designs on control. So music, obviously, especially in this film, it's on the one hand about expression and emotion and sensuality and sensation, but on the other, particularly for Tar, it's about meticulous control. It's about arrangement and order and hierarchy. And in the character of Tar and so the space of the podium, those two things converge with her, right? It's where she gives almost sermons about the affective and emotional power of music, but it's also the place where she ritually humiliates her first cellist and embarrasses Sharon by touching Olga's face after the solo. And it's really in the conversation with Gopnik, she starts to imagine herself on the podium as God, right? The person who sets the universal clock in motion. You can't start without me.
Right.
She's the let there be light. But these things also come up in the bedroom. Sissy Spacek is a choral teacher. Significant events in that film happen around the instruction of music and the act of conducting. And you obviously are a musician, have a background in music. So I just wonder if you can think for the audience a little bit about the way that music and musicality shapes the way you work as a filmmaker.
I don't know. I mean, probably not in a way that's terrifically conscious, to be honest with you. I mean, when I'm working on material like I am now, I'll typically find, like a lot of people that work on scripts or fiction. You know, I mean, I have a fiction writer friend. All he does is listen to Pink Noise, famously. You know, but typically I'll find a track or 2 or 3 tracks, and if they feel right, that's all I'll listen to when I write a script. And so they're kind of baked into the DNA of the material, and that music may or may not ever see the light of day after I leave my desk. You know, sometimes I'll play music on set if there's no dialogue. You know, and in this case, especially because the first person that I met with when I was on the ground in Berlin was Hildur Gondedottir. And Hildur, you know, one of the first questions she asked me, she said, what were you listening to when you wrote the script? And I said, well, there's this many things, but there's this one piece in particular, and I played it for her. And she said, well, what does that piece mean to you? I said, it feels like her engine. And she said, okay, well, then that's her internal rhythm. That's 120 beats per second. So let's write something. Let me write something for at that beat. And maybe we use it, maybe you don't use it, but something that you could play on set or put into her ear. Okay, now what about Sharon? And so basically we tempo mapped all the characters. So, you know, Sophie Coward, the young cellist who plays Olga Makina, you know, her tempo is 60 beats a minute, so half, right? So in that way, just in terms of what you don't hear, but what you would see, just on a metronomic way, music was very important, or tempo was important. And I think tempo is more important than anything, more than anything having to do with a high line or a lyric or anything like that. It's really just a pulse, you know.
Well, I want to address this sort of, I guess, elephant in the room, which is the character of Tar. Let's talk a little bit about Tar herself, because obviously she's the center of the film in many ways. But you mentioned earlier in our conversation, and you've mentioned in other interviews as well, that this is a character that you couldn't get to shut up, that stuck with you for a long time. I've heard you describe her as sort of like a devil or an angel on your shoulder. And appropriately in the film, she criticizes her own New Yorker performance as being too garrulous, right? She can't stop talking, these sorts of things. So I'm just curious, what was it about this character of Tar, or this idea that wouldn't let you go? And what questions or problems did she allow you to think about that maybe some other character wouldn't allow you to access?
I think that, you know, she kind of has a Arthur Jensen complex, you know, and she thinks that everybody else is Howard Beale in a way. I think, you know, it's that she feels like she's always the smartest person in a room. And I think she's also a character who, you know, when I first started thinking about her, to be fair to her, because she didn't really announce herself as, you know, from the beginning, she announced herself like, you know, fully formed, like today. But in trying to think, okay, how did she become who she is? You know, why is she the way she is? You have to go back to the child, you know. And I think that there's she has a lot of chips on her shoulder, you know, and she has some proclivities based on all kinds of things having to do with her makeup and who she is a person, regardless of her background. But there's also a lot of overcompensating that she does. I mean, so I think that she found real salvation as a young person in the most unlikely sort of form of culture, given her background. And then ran toward it in a way that was passionate and brutal and naive, and that someone who actually came from a much closer background to what would typically happen in terms of ascension, in terms of apprenticeship, in terms of schooling, would never allow themselves to have even imagined that they could sort of, you know, climb these lofty heights that this character has. So it's complicated. I mean, when we meet her, she, you know, she's turning 50, she's thinking about legacy. She's achieved almost comically, you know, and impossibly so many things, you know, that there's nothing left, you know, and all of these things are sort of, you know, coming to roost at the same time, including some of her behavior, which has been enabled based on, you know, this sort of unfortunate truths of how power works. And it's a really rough few weeks for her. So.
Yeah, there's people have had better weeks than that. Well, one aspect of her biography that you're careful to sort of cultivate in these very subtle ways, but I think are really compelling, is actually the foundation of her work as a composer. She did not begin as a composer, she did not begin as a conductor, but she was an ethnomusicologist. And the film makes that very clear right from the jump with this extended credit sequence that rolls over top of audio of her doing field recordings with the Shinibo Kobibo, or I can't recall the exact pronunciation, but down in the Amazon.
Right.
And I think this is such an interesting choice to take this character who is so, by the time we meet her as Tar, she's so completely sealed in this world of elite culture and elite cultural institutions. And she's so cultivated, her persona, her mystique. She's no longer Linda Tár from Staten Island. She's Lydia Tár with the little accent, which is a very kind of like hilariously like middle brow way to imagine being like kind of mid-Atlantic and European. I think that's a very funny detail. But by the time we meet her, she's become this other person. But the foundation of her career really lies in this other cultural space, this other professional space. And it's not the sealed environment of classical music in Berlin. It's cross-cultural encounter. It's global
Right.
South, global North encounter. And so I wonder if you can speak about your choice to begin the film in that place, to make that the foundation of her biography. And then also speak a bit about one of the ways that you mark that in the film, which is with this photo that hangs in her Berlin flat where she works, which was created by David Diaz-Gonzalez,
Yeah.
which our patrons down in the theater were able to view and learn a little bit about this afternoon. So if you can just talk about those things together.
Okay. Well, I mean, the idea about her going into, getting her doctorate in ethnomusicology, I thought was important because here's a character that, has gotten a scholarship, presumably, especially given her background to Harvard. And what I imagine is she went there and she was very, very excited, and she maybe had, and she was able to get through things, but she had a little bit of a breakdown. And she wasn't that far from the student Max that she goes after in this Juilliard class. She there by the grace of God go I. She was Max. She wanted to break glass ceiling. She wanted to change things up. She wasn't interested in canonical work or dead white man music or any of that. Nothing patriarchal at all. And she wanted to get her doctorate, and she needed a change of scenery. And so when she goes down to the Ucayali River Valley in eastern Amazon, it's like 1989, 1990. Now that area today is fairly well trod, by a lot of new age tourism, for lack of a better term, and people going down there and having ayahuasca trips and things like that. It's fairly mainstream, and but back then it would have been not the case. Back then the only sort of people that there've been few and far between people that were doing that sort of field work down there. If you go back and look at like the Field Museum, or you look at the Smithsonian, they chronicled it, but they were kind of the first people down there, so I wanted it to be something that felt like it had real intent for her. Now, part of that field work, is very practical. You're logging, and you're chronicling, and you're taking a deep dive into the origin of culture, the origin of story, the origin of song in this case with the Icaros. But also, essentially the idea is that she, as much as one can, participated in ceremonies. So if you'd ever spent time in such a ceremony, the idea is about shedding your ego. It's about changing, taking off a mask and seeing, what's really underneath and all of this. So I imagine that she had come out of that experience a very, very different individual than the individual that went to Harvard. And that had a huge, very, very powerful portation for her, where when she went back into concert music, she had a point of view that was very fresh and very powerful, and she felt strong. And so all this other, all of her other sort of biography, this very potent biography of working with the Caroline Shaws of the world and working with the Hildegunde daughters of the world, and still working outside of the canon, was kind of how she rose. But ultimately, it's like the old saying, like, when you're young, you want to live on the cool street where there's graffiti and broken glass, and when you're, my age, you're just looking for, a clean toilet. So I think that, ultimately she became the thing that she never wanted to become, right? So now she's sitting atop this, the largest cultural institution for classical music that exists today. And that involves human resources and politics and winks and nods and favors and decision making that as a group and all of these things that she's not so equipped to deal with in a healthy manner, So I think there's the contrast of when she was at a very specific age, say Max's age, until she was maybe 29, 30. And now she's 50, she's twice that age, right? And so, sort of leaping ahead, say, to the Juilliard scene, when she's kind of speaking to herself in a way, I mean, that's one of the things that's happening, is she's kind of trying to tell her young self, don't bother, this is what really matters. And in another way, she's literally just bitter because the person that, of course, she's shooting down, Anna Thorvasdottir, is younger, and is writing the kind of music that she's been struggling to write and that she threw out the film, and is praised for doing it, and I think that for me, that was really important, which is that she goes after the student first. And why does she go after them? She goes after them because she's jealous, she's envious,
Right. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about how the collaboration with Zapiri Ground and David came about, for the way that's one of the key ways that element of her biography sort of like persists in the film. And I think it's really crucial that it's included and that it's part of the world of the film, because I think it opens out this completely other way of thinking about that as a film that's not about, or not singly about, this rarefied elite space of cultural production, but it's really a story about the global terrain of culture and cultural power and cultural authority, and where decisions get made about what canon counts and these sorts of things. So if you can just introduce us to
Sure.
the collaboration that brought that image about.
Well, one of the first things, the whole, and these things are always dangerous, to chronicle, because you never know if you really get it right. But if I remember this correctly, the reason that I sort of wound up in the neighborhood of David, and with this as an idea of the place that she would go, was I had stumbled across an image that David had, a photograph of his that was so haunting, and that I couldn't, it cast a spell. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I wanted to know who was the photographer, where was this? I had no idea. I just saw an image, and that's kind of what got me probably into the idea of the Shipibo Kanibo in the first place. And so when I was I turned to Nigel Wool, who was our executive producer and our line producer on the film. And I said, I have this image. I don't know where David is. I can't find him online. Can you find him? And about 2 weeks later, he said, "I've just gotten off the phone with Jack Wheeler, and would you like to speak with David? You know, this afternoon." I was like, "Oh yeah, great." So we started talking, and David, if you've seen that image, you know, that's a ceremony. She's in the middle of ceremony, and Ruperto, who was the shaman in that photograph, that really came from David. That was a really important collaboration, because when I talked to him, I said, I don't know, I want there to be some kind of absolute. There has to be a record. We don't have to point at it or anything, but we have to have a record that she was there. And I had come up with several different ideas, and he said, "Well, I think it should be in ceremony." And the moment he said that, I said, "Okay, that's great." And then we had to figure out how to do that, you know. And that was a very interesting technical exercise for David and for us. And it involved sharing of equipment and measurements and light sources and all the usual things of photography. And then ultimately we took David's work and Ruperto, and then we brought it to Berlin with Olaf Hein and brought Kate into it, and that's how that image was created. So that was really important, and that was a first step long before we made the film. The other one is what you point out, which is the beginning credits, you know, again, this idea of going to that part of the world, into that culture, shedding the ego, letting everything go, you know, it was sort of self-apparent, you know, that one way of illustrating that would be the last is first and the first is last, you know, in terms of credits. And also because we're dealing with a film, obviously it has to do with hierarchy. She spends a good deal of time talking to Adam about the Shipibo Kanibo, and she compares the way that their interpretation of song or an Icaro compared to, say, Leonard Bernstein's. She, you know, there's much said about that, but the only opportunity we would actually have to hear that without having to know what it is in this kind of ethnographic field recording is during the beginning credits. And so, you know, we were very, very lucky, because Stephen Griffiths, who was our sound designer, his nephew, Zach Griffiths, had just graduated from the University of London School of African and Oriental Studies for Ethnomusicology in London. And we flew him down there, and he went up the river for 2 days, and he met with Mama Elisa, who's another shaman, Elisa Vargas Fernandez, at the San Clemente Center, and she, you know, an Icaro comes through the shaman, and she sang this Curamente for us for the film, and just for us, you know, and that was a really powerful thing, you know. It was and a really important thing, and it was both of these collaborations involved intense amounts of dialogue and coordination, so there was real meaning for us just through process together.
Right. I just want to think about this a little bit more, because I think this detail of her biography, when you see it in the course of the larger film, to me, it really transformed the way I watched the film from the first time I saw it, simply because it suddenly made it clear, or it made it seem to me that the film is not necessarily what it has been portrayed by in a lot of criticism or popular writing, which is a kind of gender swapped Me Too, like, wouldn't it be wacky if an abuser was a woman, sort of thing. It, like, that to me sort of constrains the film and its analysis of power in a certain way. And of course the film engages that. It references Placido Domingo and these sorts of things. I mean, it's present in the film, but I'm also conscious of the way that throughout the film, the presence of her time in the Amazon, the place of Asia and other parts of the global South break in again and again and again, and make themselves known, sometimes literally. Somebody appears to be perhaps breaking into her home, however bunker-like, and etching the markings that are placed on her face on the back of the Metronome cover. or leaving them in Plato and Petra's room, or engraving or marking them on the inside cover of that copy of Vita Sackville-West's Challenge. There's a brief moment between Tár and Francesca where Tár is frustrated at Deutsche Grammophon's reluctance to give the recording a full LP release and do digital only. And Francesca says, oh, well, this other composer is going to get a proper LP recording. And Tár flippantly says, oh, well, of course, the Chinese market's crazy, right?
Yes,
There's
Lang.
Sorry?
Yeah. Lang, who's Sophie Kauer, who's the cellist in the film, is actually playing with Lang Bach right now as we speak. So
there's a sense that there's a different set of cultural poles, a different set of cultural activities and gatekeepers and leaders that Tár doesn't seem to be aware that she's not a part of, or maybe she is aware that she's not a part of. And of course, ultimately in the film's final act, she ends up in Southeast Asia, suddenly subject to a whole cultural world, adjunct to a whole cultural world that she was very likely entirely ignorant of before. And I couldn't stop thinking about, and she begins the film by saying, you can't start without me. And then as it turns out, the film ends with her entering a world that's been going on the whole time without her anyway, right? That there's a whole realignment of cultural power happening in the film that I think is a much broader question than just like, she behaved badly in this elite cultural space in Berlin. It's a larger question about cultural power, it seems to me.
Yeah, the lens I think is important, because there's you could say, oh, she fell from power, and oh, look where she is. And the thing is that you could look at it a whole nother lens, which is, she's a conductor. A conductor has to have an instrument. An instrument are human beings. So a conductor without human beings is mute and silent. The one thing that she, the one thing that she loses, that she underlines at the beginning, is she loses control of time, in so much as at the end she's handed us headphones, and presumably she's listening to a click track. But outside of that, anyone will tell you, Hildur Guðnadóttir will tell you this, any major composer and many conductors, video games are really, really important. And some of the finest music being composed right now and underscoring going on today is for video games. Video games are choose your own adventure situations. They're variable. There's all kinds of things that can be done with them. It's far from some being banished or exiled into some Dante's Inferno. It's very mainstream, and it's certainly more lucrative and more popular, obviously, than classical music. So yeah, you're right. The scales have fallen from a very particular set of lenses that she's been looking through, and she's going to see a different world, and maybe that world will, maybe she'll see things differently, or maybe she won't,
Todd, thank you so much for joining us. I can't tell you what a delight it is for the center, what a delight it is for our audience down in the theater, and not to be a weenie, but for me personally, I'm a huge fan of your filmmaking and a huge fan of this film. So it's been a real delight to chat with you, and we appreciate your time so much.
I appreciate your time, and thank you guys for coming tonight. And Tyler, thank you for the conversation. I really appreciate it.